in the world to introduce because everybody knows him, everybody appreciates him. If you are new here and have not heard Todd, he is a tremendous historian, brings history to life. 2 or 3 people said if I had had history like that when I was in school, I really would have studied harder, and it's very interesting. So I'm glad you're here. This is the finale for Andrew Jackson, and I think it's going to be a great finish. But I look forward to what's coming next. I saw in the booklet that it's with elections and quirky things and so forth.
Yes.
So without further ado, Todd DiPastina.
Thank you, Donna. And I know many of you have just come from Johnstown and saw plays. It's been a long day already, so I'll try to keep this lively. I love coming here and giving these talks. I gave a lecture today at a high school. And this is like high school seniors in AP European history. These are top level students. And man, it's like they could not care less what I had to say. Oh my gosh, I gave it my all, and I felt like I was just barely keeping them awake. And I wanted to shame them and say, you know what, later tonight I'm going to be going to Masonic Village, a room full of people who want to be there. But yeah, this is our last. We're finally putting Andrew Jackson to bed. This is the last lecture on Andrew Jackson. I did think I would save the worst for last, because Andrew Jackson is most remembered and most vilified for the forced removal, I think you do have to call it, of between about 50,000 and 100,000, we don't know exactly how many, Native Americans from their ancestral homes in Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, out to west of the Mississippi River, to what was then called Indian Territory, and what is now called Oklahoma. And these were the 5 civilized tribes who lived in the Southeast, and we have a few people here who know the 5 civilized tribes.
Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole.
The 5 civilized tribes.
Seminoles,
yeah. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and the Seminole. The 5 civilized tribes. And there was a reason they were called the 5 civilized tribes, which I'll talk about. You should know that the Trail of Tears, and it's been called the Trail of Tears, it was very deadly. We don't know how many died on the way. The best estimates are maybe about a fifth to a quarter of all those who took the trip didn't make it. We do know that there are thousands of plots, burial plots along the way. It didn't happen all at once. It happened over the course of 7 years between 1831 and 1838. It wasn't one route, but many routes, depending on where you came from. People traveled by foot 1,000 miles. They traveled by horseback. They traveled in large caravans of 1,000 people. They traveled in small family units. Some of them traveled by steamboat part of the way. Some of them even traveled by railroad part of the way. They would have been better off walking. But over between that 7 years, about 50,000 to 100,000 Native Americans made the move west of the Mississippi. Today, I want to talk about why they were moved and how it worked. And of course, the why, really in part or in how, is Andrew Jackson himself. He made this very much a priority of his first administration. When he became president, he did not say much about what he was going to do as president. But he did say this. He did say, I will encourage the removal of Native Americans from the Southeast. And sure enough, in his first State of the Union address in December 1829, he said, I suggest to Congress, I suggest for your consideration the propriety of setting apart an ample district west of the Mississippi and outside the limits of any state or territory now formed, to be guaranteed to the Indian tribes so long as they shall occupy it, each tribe having a distinct control over the portion designated for its use. And it should be known, this was the basis of what was called the Indian Removal Act, which was passed the following year in 1830. And you should know the Indian Removal Act did not force Indians to move west. It simply designated the land and created a fund to pay for their moving west, to make tribal offers to pay them to leave the Southeast. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It was actually a scheme that Andrew Jackson was working to kind of force the Indians to move. But it wasn't, you won't find in the legislation, you know, we're gonna move these tribes by point of the bayonet 1,000 miles west. That is not part of it at all. In fact, Andrew Jackson sold the Trail of Tears as a humanitarian move, as an act of beneficence, of charity from the federal government to the Indians. He was doing them a favor. You've got to understand, in 1830, Americans were very, very divided about what they thought and felt about Native Americans. Very divided. There was a lot of opinion. On one end of opinion, there were people who sentimentalized Native Americans, romanticized them, thought that they were noble people, far and above, you know, in terms of morality and authentic humanness, far and above European civilization. It must be said that most of the people who believed that about Native Americans didn't actually know any Native Americans. They tended to live in New England, where there weren't many, if any, Native Americans living. And then way at the other end of the spectrum were people who hated American Indians and wanted them either exterminated or moved off the land. And that was an extreme view, and that was Andrew Jackson's view. Andrew Jackson, most Americans were right in between those two poles. You know, they didn't want to hurt American Indians, but they certainly saw American Indians and tribal customs as an impediment to progress. So most of Americans were not on board with Andrew Jackson's extreme attitudes toward Native Americans. So Jackson really had to modulate his rhetoric about them and to, you know, let people know that this Indian removal program was an act of beneficence. And here's what he said. Our ancestors found the Indians, the uncontrolled possessors of these vast regions. By persuasion and force, they have been made to retire from river to river and from mountain to mountain until some of the tribes have become extinct and others have left but remnants to preserve for a while their once terrible names. Surrounded by the whites with their arts of civilization, which by destroying the resources of the savage, doom him to weakness and decay, that this fate surely awaits them if they remain within the limits of the states does not admit of a doubt. Humanity and national honor demand that every effort should be made to avert so great a calamity. In other words, these Native Americans are going to die. They're going to be murdered, they're going to die of sickness, they're going to decay, and their societies are going to rot away unless we separate them from white civilization where they might be able to survive. We're doing them a favor. We're protecting them from and potential violence from the locals in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi especially. I have to say, you know that I run the Veterans Breakfast Club, and every week, every Monday night at 7 p.m. and every Thursday night at 7 p.m., we have an online program that live streams on YouTube, and we get a bunch of people joining us in the Zoom room, and we have interesting conversation with veterans from different eras and ages. Last week, we had this man, Yoshio Nakamura. And Yoshio, he was 99 years old, he was on Zoom from California. Fascinating man, a wonderful artist. And that was what he did as a career. He was, as a child, rounded up and put into an internment camp, a Japanese relocation camp. Then he was recruited for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He fought in Italy and southern France and was wounded and came home. He has a remarkable, wonderful story. But he said on our program, he said, what I'll never forget and what really irritates me still to this day is being told, he was 17 years old, being told that he was being put into a camp for my own protection. that white Americans were going to harm me and they were protecting me for putting me in these camps. He said, I'd like to have taken my chances, staying in California. Andrew Jackson. Now, this guy had a long reputation for moving Native Americans. He had, if you'll recall, the Treaty of Horseshoe Bend, which was after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, he got the Creek Indians to cede 30 million acres to the federal government. 30 million acres. Just remarkable. In 1818, he invades Florida without authorization, and he seizes Seminole land, and it gets ceded to the United States. So he has a long history of kind of removing Native Americans from their land. And the question is why? What motivated Andrew Jackson and other Americans to want to move these Native Americans off their lands in the Southeast? And I think it comes down to three things, and I want to talk about each one of them. The first is actually really important, but you're not going to read it much in history books. It would be hard to teach in high schools today, I think, but it's accurate. Andrew Jackson saw Native Americans as a national security threat, and a lot of Americans did. These are people who are not pledging allegiance to the United States of America, and yet they live within the United States of America in domestic dependent nations. They live in separate nations that are within the nation of the United States. This is a very strange thing to have in our country. Are these tribes, these Indian, what we call today reservations, that are independent from state governments and from federal governments, and whose citizens or residents pledge allegiance to the tribe, not to the nation. This was irritating to Andrew Jackson, and at one point in our history, it was definitely a national security problem. I mean, think about it this way. You have these Native Americans, hundreds of thousands of them, living within North America, hostile to the United States of America, allying themselves and making deals with hostile foreign powers, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, being given weapons and training to wage what we would call today guerrilla war on the frontier with American settlers. These are people who are undermining and subverting the stability of this young republic in North America that is really pretty fragile in the early years of the republic. And I think the alliance that Isaac Brock, this General Mace or Isaac Brock, with Tecumseh during the War of 1812, and this is a Canadian stamp. We would not have them on a US stamp. These are the Canadian heroes of the War of 1812. They're on the other side. They make this remarkably powerful alliance to fight the United States of America in the War of 1812. Here's a cartoon you could see of Indians scalping an American soldier and giving the scalp to a British officer. Indians were seen as allies of the British. They were British agents here on American soil living among us. You couldn't trust them. And we had to move them out. Now, while it may have, I think Andrew Jackson had a case to be made in 1812. By 1830, come on. These people are not a threat to anybody. They are, especially the 5 civilized tribes, they are civilized. They are farmers. They're living in nuclear family households. Some of them are slave owners in the South. They are no longer, they can no longer be funded or supported by the British Empire. They're not a threat at all. So this argument, I think, while it once did hold water, it doesn't by the time Andrew Jackson is in the White House. The other reason, number 2, is of course land. The Native Americans were sitting on valuable land. And that land became even more valuable in 1793 when this guy invented what?
Cotton.
Yes, the cotton gin. I love it. This is a guy, he is a hat pin maker from New Haven, Connecticut. What the heck is a hat pin? He made them. And he's touring the South, And he sees, he watches as 5 enslaved people are by hand picking through cotton balls and extracting the seeds by hand. It takes these 5 slaves 10 hours each to pick through 1 pound of cotton. And he thinks there's got to be a better way. And so he creates this thing, this cotton gin, where you turn a crank, you feed the cotton in, and it combs through the cotton and gives you the fiber and separates the seed. This thing, 1 man working 1 hour could clean a pound of cotton. He had improved the productivity of cotton picking, de-seeding, by a factor of 50. All of a sudden, that southern land becomes hugely valuable because cotton needs at least 210 days, frost-free days, with well-drained soil to grow, and there aren't many places in the world where you can grow cotton, but the U.S. South is one of them. And it just so happened that a lot of Native Americans lived on some of the best cotton land. Cotton immediately became, almost immediately after the cotton gin, the most valuable commodity that the United States produced. By 1830, cotton was worth in all our other exports more than all our other exports combined. There was a huge generation of human beings here in North America in the decades after the American Revolution. The population more than tripled between the time of the meeting of the first Congress to the election of Andrew Jackson. But those people in the South, they were growing cotton in huge amounts. Here are 2 maps. Both maps show, see these areas in brown? These areas in brown are the counties where at least 100 bales of cotton were produced in a season. I'm sorry, 1,000 bales of cotton were produced in a season. You can see in 1790, not many counties in the American South. By 1830, look how many. In the darker shades of brown, 5,000 bales of cotton per county. In 1790, Americans grew 1.5 million pounds of cotton. 1830, 330 million pounds of cotton. And this cotton was sold north to textile factories. It was also sold to England to textile factories, and it was incredibly valuable. I mean, that black soil was like a gold mine to American settlers who wanted to make a killing in the South. And then, you throw in the discovery of an actual gold mine in Georgia, which did happen in 1828, and it happened to be on Cherokee land. And you truly have a land rush. I mean, you have a situation where Georgia settlers on Cherokee land, here's a map. You can see the green is the Cherokee part of Georgia, and the gold bars are where the gold is in Georgia. You have Georgia settlers kind of raiding Indian villages, driving the Indians away, burning down the village, and then getting to work mining gold. Gold is there. So there's a land hunger in the United States like there never had been before. And then the third issue, and this is another tricky one to talk about, is racism. Andrew Jackson, by the time he's president, expresses a lot of racism toward Native Americans. This was new on Jackson's part. Jackson had not talked like this before. And I think that's because most Americans had not talked like this before, because this is not how people thought. People didn't think Native Americans, they're a different race, they're biologically inferior, they could never be citizens because they're inferior to white people. That's not how they thought. How they thought was Indians, savages, backward, primitive. They need schools. The men need to cut their hair. They need to learn how to farm. They need to learn how to read the Bible. They need to settle down, and then they'll be good little Americans. That it had nothing to do with the color of their skin or their race or anything. It just had to do with their cultural background. If you indoctrinate them into American culture, they'll become good little Americans. That was the idea. That was not so much the idea here expressed by Andrew Jackson in 1833. This is really something new. And it is something new in the world, where we start to view people as biologically different. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire for improvement. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances or disappear. That's what Jackson said in 1833. Senator John Forsyth from Georgia put it more directly. Indians are a race not admitted to be equal to the rest of the community, treated somewhat like human beings, but not admitted to be free men, and probably never to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. This view, this racist view, was not at all the view of the founding fathers. The founders, in fact, all the presidents right up to Jackson, had a very strong faith that what Native Americans needed, they needed to be civilized. That was the word, civilized, and that meant educated. They need to be educated into how to farm like a European, how to speak, like how to worship, how to live in family units like a European. I mean, there were a lot of things to change. These Native Americans were nuts. Do you know what they did? They put women in charge of their politics. Oh, brother. I mean, the men, their role in Indian society, they were essentially sperm donors, right? Who then left and went out on the hunt and never saw their kids. And it's the women who kept the villages running. And they were really, many of these tribes were matrilineal. But they were also kind of matriarchal in the sense that women were the ones who did the farming, and they were the ones who made the decisions on behalf of the clan and the group and the village and often even the tribe. And that had to stop, Get these men off the hunt, get them to settle down, become heads of households, take their proper position as men. There was a lot of learning that had to be done. There was a lot of, learning how to be a Christian. But just how to be a farmer. And this was the official American policy toward Native Americans from Washington all the way through John Quincy Adams. It was funded through the War Department. I think that's so significant. It was the War Department that paid to civilize Native Americans because Native Americans were a national security threat. And so this was a military issue. This was a national security issue. So the War Department funded Indian agents like Benjamin Hawkins, who's a very well-known Indian agent who traveled throughout the country, really trying to teach Native Americans how to grow corn and other crops, wheat and other crops like Europeans did. Thomas Jefferson really, his view was that I think Jefferson would be stunned if he came back today and learned that we had Indian reservations in this country. He'd be stunned. He absolutely thought he was a little weird in many ways. But he had this pretty romantic view that white people, white Americans, and Native Americans would marry and intermix, and that we would become a kind of a different race of people from the Europeans because of that. And he said this often. This is from a speech he gave to a group of Delaware Indians. You will unite yourself with us, join our great councils, and form one people with us, and shall all be Americans. You will mix with us by marriage, your blood will run within our veins, and will spread over this great continent. And, he was talking to Native Americans who dressed like this. They had aspects of their traditional dress, but they also wore European clothes. Maybe they had a Scottish father or an English father, but a Native American mother. So there was this sense that, yes, this was a blending that was happening. And the emphasis was always on civilizing. If you civilize, you can become partners with the federal government, partners with the United States of America. And that was always the assumption, and that was the path that these 5 tribes in the South deliberately pursued. The Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. They elected, over time, to civilize themselves. They accepted the entreaties of missionaries, Moravians especially. We know Moravians because of Moravian College here in Pennsylvania. Moravians were big into missionary work in the South, with Native Americans. They accepted the missionaries. They encouraged the missionaries. They transformed their tribes. The men settled down and became farmers. They had nuclear families. They built Western-style housing. You could see it. You could see it there, like living in Western-style housing, wearing Western-style clothes, reading the Bible, having churches. They're making that effort. They want to live like Americans so that they're able to keep their land and keep their tribal units intact. I do want to just take a moment and point out this map. It's a little bit hard to see. This is a map of Cherokee country from the original Cherokee claims before the American Revolution down through Jackson's day. And you'll see this red outline. These are the original Cherokee lands. By the time Jackson was in office, this orange line is where it had reduced. So you can see how much land the Cherokee had lost over just several decades. The Cherokee, more than any tribe, all the civilized tribes were civilized, but the Cherokee was the most civilized. They embraced the civilization offer or project with more gusto than any other tribe. I mean, they went all out to be complete European Americans, and they succeeded wildly. They were quite a well-off tribe. You had several Cherokee Indians who were millionaires, in our sense. James Vann, here he is, he's a Cherokee. His mother was Cherokee because it's matrilineal. So long as your mother's Indian, you're an Indian. So his mother was a Cherokee, his father, I think, was British. He owned about 100 slaves. He had a tavern, he grew cotton, he lived in this house. He was one of the wealthiest men in all of the South. I love this picture. There are a lot of people, this is how I'm gonna put it. There are a lot of people who live in Oklahoma today who are black, but they do not identify as black, they identify as Cherokee. Lots of them, and as Choctaw. And they were slaves of Cherokee owners. But slavery, I think we could probably use one or two more books about how slavery worked in these Indian tribes. Here's a picture of a slave and his master. It's hard to tell who is who. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They're standing abreast like equals or something. I mean, and he's dressed better than he is. So it's a really interesting dynamic that's taking place, I think, in these Indian tribes. And the Cherokee are succeeding wildly. And this is where, how as I get older, I like to digress on things that really fascinate me. It'll happen to you someday. I want to talk about one of my favorite people in history, and I truly mean that. And that is this guy, Sequoyah. He was a Cherokee Indian. He is one of my favorite individuals from history. He, like many Native Americans, had two names. He had an Indian name and he had a European name. Sequoyah, his European name was George Gist. His father was Christopher Gist. You know who Christopher Gist was? The man who saved George Washington when George Washington fell into the Allegheny River and could have frozen to death. Christopher Gist was his Indian guide and saved him. Well, that was Sequoyah's grandfather. Sequoyah's father was Nathaniel, his grandfather was Christopher. Sequoyah was a silversmith, and like most Native Americans, he was illiterate because very few, if any, Native Americans had any kind of written language. There had been rudimentary written languages when the Europeans arrived, but not many. And most Native Americans thought that writing was a trick, that Europeans were trying to fool Indians into thinking that they could communicate with talking leaves, that you could look at markings on a paper and get words from them. No way. That is probably a trick, or it's magic. And Sequoyah, the silversmith, dealt a lot with white Americans, and he became fascinated with writing and reading. He was illiterate. He got it in his craw that he was going to invent a writing system for the Cherokee, and he did it. The only person in history, the only one in history, ever to create a written language for people that didn't have any language. When he died, he was literate, but only in the language that he created. He never became literate in English or any other language. He was a silversmith. He started obsessing about this. He decided to quit his work. He had kids and a wife. Can you imagine what she said? You know, he quit his job, and full time, he's going to create this written language. His wife got so furious with him that she collected all his papers and threw them in a fire. Yes. He said, "Thank you. I was going down the wrong path." He thought that every word was a symbol of the thing. So he was creating symbols of everything he could think of. And he was up to like 3,000 symbols. And he knew he had thousands more to go. And he knew this couldn't possibly be it. This couldn't possibly be how it worked. That nobody could memorize, 8,000, 10,000 symbols. And then it struck him that maybe what they're doing is these symbols represent sounds. And that if you make an alphabet, he didn't really have the language for that, a symbol that represented sounds, you could make any word out of the collection of symbols representing sounds. So he did it. He created 86 symbols. Where did he get these symbols? From books written in languages he couldn't read. He picked them out. These are symbols from ancient Greece. They're Latin symbols. They're what's the Eastern European Cyrillic symbols. He's borrowing symbols just left and right to create an alphabet. And he does it. He creates this alphabet, and it works. He has a 6-year-old daughter. She adores him. Daughters always adore their dads until they grow up and they abandon you. Not that I'm bitter about that. And he traveled throughout Cherokee Nation with his 6-year-old daughter, and he did this little trick. He would invite anybody to come up to him and whisper a word in his ear. Then Sequoia would write the word down on a piece of paper, and his 6-year-old daughter would read the word, and the whole crowd would go nuts. They thought it was magic, but they eventually got convinced that, yeah, this is a real written language. And within 5 years, the entire tribe was literate in this new Cherokee language. You could go to Oklahoma City today and see it written in signs. This written language allowed the Cherokee to do something that no other tribe did. They wrote a constitution, a written constitution. They created a federal government, a Cherokee federal government, located here in New Ekota, on Cherokee land in Georgia. They created a president of the Cherokee Nation, a Supreme Court, a House of Representatives, and a Senate. They very much modeled everything after the U.S. Constitution. And they had it all set up. And leading this government and leading this community were these two men, Major Ridge, really fascinating men, and his protege, much younger, 20 years younger than he was, John Ross. Major Ridge, his name was Ridge, which was a rough translation of his Cherokee name. He was born in 1771, I would say, and by the time, he hated Americans, white Americans, hated them, fought them. He took his first American scalp at age 17. By the time he was 20, he had seen half of the villages in the Cherokee Nation destroyed, burned, 75% of the population gone. And by the time he was 30, he had a change of heart. We cannot continue this way. We cannot continue to lose people and lose land. Our only hope is to embrace civilization. He made a very abrupt change. And he partnered with John Ross, a very smart, talented young Cherokee. John Ross was fluent in Cherokee and English. Father was English, mother was Cherokee. He had 2 suits of clothing. He could switch on both, work both sides all the time. There was a TV movie made about this drama between these two men. and it starred Johnny Cash as John Ross. It was called The Trail of Tears. And Major Ridge, I mean, he went all in. He volunteered to fight with Andrew Jackson at Horseshoe Bend. That's why he was Major Ridge. He was a military major. John Ross was his lieutenant. They fought side by side with Andrew Jackson. They knew him personally. Major Ridge, when his own son, John, grew up, and his nephew, Elias Boudinot, he sent John and Elias to Connecticut, Cornwall, Connecticut, to get an education at the Foreign Missions Boarding School. It was colloquially called the Heathen School, where they would take, and they were foreigners, they would take foreigners and civilize them. These guys were considered foreigners, and they went to the boarding school. So this is how much they embraced the civilization project. That this was going to be how they saved their tribe. And man, they had a lot to contend with because Andrew Jackson had a plan that didn't really respect the civilization project at all. Andrew Jackson set up Indian removal to be very much a good cop, bad cop kind of dynamic. The Indian Removal Act and Jackson's role as president did not force Indians to leave, didn't use any violence against Indians to force them to leave, but he relied on local populations to commit the vigilante violence against the Indians. He needed violence, he needed raids on Indian villages, the burning down of Indian towns, the lynching of Indians, the threatening of Indians. He needed all that to be happening on Indian land so that he could come in and say, isn't it terrible what they're doing? I'm so sorry that you're suffering from this. There is one way out. We have land for you west of the Mississippi. We'll take you there. We'll provide food and forage and firewood for your trip there. We'll give you money. We'll buy the land from you and we'll transport you. So privately he'd say, light up, and he did say this directly, light a fire under them, they'll move. But he needed the fire. He needed the fire under them. So he relied on this vigilante action that was being taken through the South against Native Americans. The first to accept the bargain were the Choctaw. They left very early, way before the other tribes. Early on, they recognized the threat, and they sold their land, and they moved as a tribe, 15,000 of them. 15,000 of them, not entirely at once, but very close together, moved to Indian territory in Oklahoma. And it was a journalist covering the Choctaw removal who came up with our term that we use, the Trail of Tears. He wrote, it's a trail of tears and death. Because out of the 15,000, the estimate is 2,500 died en route. Measles, typhoid, other diseases. It just so happens Alexis de Tocqueville, the great writer, the French aristocrat, was touring the United States. And he was there when he saw Choctaw removal, and he wrote about it in Democracy in America. In the whole scene, there was an air of ruin and destruction, something which betrayed a final and irrevocable adieu. One couldn't watch without feeling one's heart wrung. The Indians were tranquil, but somber and taciturn. There was one who could speak English and of whom I asked why the Choctaws were leaving their country. To be free, he answered. I could never get any other reason out of him. We watched the expulsion of one of the most celebrated and ancient American peoples. I think that answer, to be free, is really interesting. And I think it's accurate. Indians were given the option to stay in Georgia, but not be a Cherokee any longer, or not be a Choctaw any longer. They would have to submit to the laws of the state of Georgia. They would have to become U.S. citizens. And most Native Americans were not willing to do that. They wanted to live in their villages, they wanted to live with their families and their tribal units. They saw themselves as member of the tribes first, and they did not want to give up their tribal identities to become citizens of the state of Georgia. Here's another quotation from another Choctaw, George Harkins. Having determined to immigrate west of the Mississippi River this fall, I have thought proper in bidding you a farewell to make a few remarks expressive of my views and the feelings that actuate me on the subject of our removal. We as Choctaws rather chose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could not be heard in their formation. So if they wanted to remain independent and free, they would have to move west of the Mississippi. No state was more harsh toward Native Americans in the Southeast than Georgia. When Andrew Jackson was elected and became president, the state of Georgia began passing really harsh laws against the Cherokee Nation, dissolving the Cherokee Constitution, that vaunted Cherokee Constitution that the Cherokee were so proud of. It turns out, I think, that the Cherokees' civilization project backfired. I think it made a lot of white Southerners resent the Cherokee even more that they were successful. They passed laws, Georgia did, not allowing any missionaries to come in to Georgia, to Cherokee land. They dissolved the Cherokee borders. They declared Cherokee land property of Georgia. In other words, they're outlawing the Cherokee Nation, and they're taking the land, confiscating the land. Just as a state, they're doing it. What do Indians do when they're confronted by a challenge like this? They hire an attorney. They sued the state of Georgia, and it went to the Supreme Court. One of the cases that the Cherokee took, and it truly was a Cherokee lawyer, defended this guy, Samuel Worcester. He was a Congregationalist minister from New Hampshire. He loved Native Americans, came down to live among the Cherokee, and as he's living there, kind of living with the Cherokee, administering to them, some Georgia state constables seize him, arrest him. He's put on trial for treason against Georgia, and he's sentenced to 4 years hard labor. The Cherokee hired an attorney and took his case, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, to John Marshall, the guy who had been on the Supreme Court for 35 years at this point. And John Marshall wrote the majority decision that declared all those Georgia laws null and void. It was a really important, Worcester v. Georgia, a very important decision in American jurisprudence, because for the first time, it really defined the legal status of these Indian nations within the United States nation. And he said, these are foreign nations that are within our own nation. They don't quite have the status of complete foreign nations. He called them domestic dependent nations. But he said, whatever you call them, what we do know is that the federal government is the only entity in North America that has the legal right to negotiate or deal with Indian nations. States do not. States do not have any jurisdiction over Indian land. And so the decision freed Samuel Worcester, and it relieved the Cherokee Nation from all of the restrictions and denials that the state had imposed upon the Cherokee Nation. It didn't matter at all. The Supreme Court decision did not matter at all. Georgia ignored it. And Andrew Jackson allowed Georgia to ignore it. Jackson was reported to have said, and I put this up here because it's such a great quotation, and I'm so sad that he never said it. He didn't. He never said it. There's no place recorded that he ever said it, but it does perfectly express his point of view. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. You know, the Supreme Court has no means of enforcement. They rely on the executive branch to enforce the law, and Jackson was refusing to enforce that law. So the law went unenforced, the ruling went unenforced. And Georgia, the Cherokee Nation, was still getting terrorized by these Georgia citizens. And so Major Ridge and John Ross traveled from New Echota in Georgia to Washington, D.C., to the White House to see their old buddy, Andrew Jackson. It was quite a reunion. These guys met with Jackson and they said, hey, man, what do Like, we fought with you at Horseshoe Bend. You've got to stop the predations of the state of Georgia. And Andrew Jackson said, I don't see things the way John Marshall sees things. My hands are tied. I don't think the Supreme Court has any jurisdiction over this. I think this is a state matter. I cannot help you. Except, I can offer that the federal government will buy your land for $5 million, will move the Cherokee off the land to Oklahoma. John Ross and Major Ridge left that meeting so disillusioned. And within a day, Major Ridge had turned around and said, we have to leave. We absolutely have to leave. There's no way we're going to be able to survive as a people unless we go west of the Mississippi River. John Ross disagreed, and these two men, John Ross on the left, Major Ridge on the right, split into two opposing parties or factions within the Cherokee Nation. Major Ridge and his son and his nephew traveled the Cherokee Nation, 16,000, 20,000 people, and gave talk after talk, meeting after meeting, night after night, urging the Cherokee to leave. And I think he was absolutely right. It's sad. I'm giving my opinion here, but he's absolutely right. This is what he said. They are strong and we are weak. We are few, they are many. We cannot remain here in safety and comfort. I know we love the graves of our fathers. We can never forget these homes, but an unbending iron necessity tells us we must leave them. I would willingly die to preserve them, but any forcible effort to keep them will cost us our lands, our lives, and the lives of our children. There is but one path of safety, one road to future existence as a nation. That path is open before you. Make a treaty of cession. Give up these lands and go over beyond the great Father of waters. That was his instruction to the Cherokee people. And the Cherokee people would not have any of it. Absolutely. I don't quite know why. I think they took literally the view that the people are one with the land. That land was their ancestral land. If they left it, they would cease to be Cherokee. They would cease to be fully human in their point of view. That's the only explanation that I could come up with. John Ross also was giving lectures saying, we'll fight them to the end, they'll never move us. And I think that was an easier speech to give. We'll never let them move us, we'll do battle. In the last week of December 1835, Major Ridge signed a treaty. This is as fraudulent a treaty as you could get, because Major Ridge did not have the support of his nation. But in the dark of night, in a cabin, Major Ridge signed a treaty with the federal government to cede all Cherokee land for $5 million. They would agree to move to Oklahoma within 2 years of the signing of the treaty, of the ratification, I should say, the ratification of the treaty. So this treaty was signed and went to the U.S. Senate. As you know, Indian treaties must be ratified by the U.S. Senate, just like treaties with foreign powers must be ratified by the Senate. So the treaty goes for debate in the Senate. And as a show of how the Cherokee Nation, did not support the treaty, John Ross got 16,000 Cherokee to sign a petition. 16,000, urging the Senate to reject the treaty. And there was a fierce and fascinating debate. If you know a graduate student in history or an undergraduate in history, they could write a wonderful paper about the debate in the Senate over this treaty, because it opened up everything about how Americans felt about Native Americans. And in the end, the treaty was ratified by one vote. It was really close. This was a horrific vote by the Senate, and in a lot of Americans' views. And a lot of Americans, especially in New England, just revolted against the Martin Van Buren administration, because by the time the treaty was ratified, Van Buren was in the White House and Andrew Jackson was gone. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great philosopher and writer, wrote this letter, just blistering letter, to Van Buren, President Van Buren. A crime is projected that confounds our understanding by its magnitude. A crime that really deprives us, as well as the Cherokees, of a country. For how could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our government? Or the land that was cursed by their parting and dying imprecations our country anymore? You, sir, will bring down that renowned chair in which you sit into infamy if your seal is set to this instrument of perfidy. And the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty, will stink to the world. With great respect, sir, I am your fellow citizen. I love how polite they were back then. But you know, those letters, they meant nothing. The treaty was ratified in May 1836, and the treaty, the Indians, the Cherokee, had 2 years to move. And I think a crime, a crime of negligence on the part of John Ross, who told the Cherokee, we're going to fight this to the end, we're never going to move. He never prepared them to move. He never. So 2 years later, in May 1838, the soldiers show up, kicking down doors, rousting people out of their homes, forcing them onto the road into what could only be called like corrals, pig sties, where they would stay at 1,000 for a while before they were rounded up in larger groups, and really by the point of a bayonet, moved west. The migration west was supposed to take 2 months to go about 1,000 miles. It ended up taking 4 months, and they ran out of food. It was bad. They didn't all go at once. They went staggered, so some went in the heat of the summer, some went in the cold of the winter. They didn't have enough clothing, they didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough forage, they didn't have enough fuel. And 1/4, about 4,000 of the 16,000 who made the trek died. 4,000. And maybe another 4,000 died shortly after arriving in Oklahoma. John Ross's own wife, Katie, died. She was sleeping in mud for too long. She had a blanket and gave it to a child, and she died of hypothermia. But that initial rousting that took place in May was remembered by this remarkable woman, Rebecca Nugent. She was a young girl in 1838. She lived to be up 100 years old. And she was interviewed in the 20th century about her memory of Indian removal. And this is what she said. When the soldiers came to our house, my father wanted to fight. But my mother told him the soldiers would kill him if he did. And we surrendered without a fight. They drove us out of our house to join the other prisoners in a stockade. After they took us away, my mother begged them to let her go back and get some bedding. So they let her go back, and she brought wet bedding and a few cooking utensils she could carry, and had to leave behind all our other household possessions. This quotation really always gets me. This is from a soldier who was a Georgia volunteer in the Civil War. He said, I fought the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands. But the Cherokee removal was the cruelest I ever saw. And these poor people were marched in every kind of weather all the way to Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, they struggled to make a new nation, to resettle. They did eventually, but it took about 30 years of a lot of violence. In fact, Major Ridge, his nephew, his son were all assassinated shortly after the arrival by the John Ross forces, shortly after arrival in Oklahoma. John Ross would live past the Civil War. He would found a new capital city, Tahlequah, in Oklahoma, and they would eventually,
It's Tahlequah.
Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Are you from Tahlequah?
No, I'm from Seminole.
Oh, you're from Seminole, really?
Yes.
And well, you know this history,
Yes.
and you know how this land reserved for the Native Americans shrunk over time, of course, as Oklahoma became a state. But it's still there, and the Cherokee are still there. And I thought after this story, and after this history of Andrew Jackson, I would end with the words of the chief of the Cherokee Nation. Because I remember years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was this movement that surprised me. I remember reading in the paper about removing Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill. And I thought, I just had not heard anything about it. And in the article, and I can't remember what newspaper it said that most people know that I didn't know this, most people know that it's a common practice among Native Americans in the United States never to carry or use a $20 bill. I had never heard that. My brother lives in Missoula, Montana. There are a lot of Native Americans there. I mentioned that to him. He said, oh yeah, oh gosh, yeah. Yeah, no. If you see somebody behind a counter, it might be Native American, you don't give them a $20 bill. And it was the Cherokee Nation that really led this movement to remove Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill and replace him maybe with Sequoyah or somebody else. And he said this, and I thought it would let him have the last words on Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson defied a U.S. Supreme Court ruling and forced the removal of our Cherokee ancestors from homelands we'd occupied in the Southeast for millennia. His actions as president resulted in a genocide of Native Americans and the death of about a quarter of our people. It remains the darkest period in the Cherokee Nation's history. Jackson's legacy was never one to be celebrated, and his image on our currency is a constant reminder of his crimes against natives. It's been an insult to our people and to our ancestors, thousands of whom died of starvation and exposure, and now lie in unmarked graves along the Trail of Tears. This, removing him from the $20 bill, is a small but meaningful vindication for them and for our tribal citizens today. That's the last word on Andrew Jackson. I will be back 3 weeks from tonight on June 12th. You might have heard that we have an election coming on. And so I thought I would do a history of electioneering in our country and how different elections were, especially in the first 100 years or so of our history. I'll see you then.